autonomous vehicles again to fuels. So I would like to welcome our next speaker, John Cooper, who has been appointed in 2015 as Director General for Fuels Europe and Concave. John, I read, has started his career in the motor industry, working on future powertrains, but that lasted only about 3 years, and then you decided you are a fuels man, right? So since then he has been working in BP downstream, and especially for, he was Director for Renewable Strategies, and has been involved in as a leadership roles in aviation fuels, lubricant, also in the UK fuels industry representative in the UK Automotive Council Technology Group, and so on. So he certainly knows what he's speaking about. So please.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much for the introduction, also for Tim. Thanks for the introduction. Can I just say, Tim, you have courage talking about the oil price and trying to work out the oil price. Also, I think you have courage standing in an emissions conference and saying cheating allowed. So I saw Penny's face at that moment. Well, let's talk about fuels for a bit. And what I'd like to talk about is the industry strategy that is being developed for the refining industry. I'm sure many of you have followed some of the news and discussion around the future of petroleum in society. And our industry has been giving deep thought, but also a lot of work in this area for many years. And now in Europe, we are looking hard at how we make some industrial transition around this to fit in with the overall societal goals in Europe and elsewhere. And I'd like to talk you through the strategy that we've now been showing and sharing for the last 2 months in Brussels, but also in capital cities with energy ministries across Europe. Here on the front, a picture of one of the 80 or so refineries in Europe. This in particular is in Rotterdam, part of a very large industry in Rotterdam supplying liquid fuels. Fuels Europe, just as an introduction, is actually the industry association in Europe representing the refining industry. Actually, we represent every single petroleum refiner in Europe, fuels refiner, and there's the member companies there. You'll see some of the largest energy companies in the world, Shell, BP, ExxonMobil, Total, companies that are headquartered, many of them in Europe, but a lot also in the US, a few headquartered in Russia. We have Rosneft and Lukoil, and some other companies headquartered outside of Europe. And so I think there's a point here. We have to think about this in global terms as well as in European terms. These companies are very large. The total value of those companies is probably well in excess of €1 trillion, and their capital spending every year well in excess of €100 billion. So very experienced energy companies. Many of them have invested in renewables. There are many companies there that are active in solar and wind, also in battery technology, but also advanced biofuels and first-generation biofuels. We think we should understand the role of liquid fuels better in terms of this overall strategy. Liquid fuels are still dominant in transport worldwide. And the view of the International Energy Agency here and their World Energy Outlook just shows what's likely to happen in the next few years. This is their new policies scenario that looks at further development of policy from today. I should be clear that the new policy scenario does not meet fully the Paris Agreement. There are other scenarios that they do that are lower in demand than this, but not substantially different. Going from the left-hand side here to the right, you go from 2016 demand through a look at several different sectors. And what's going on there is interesting. Of course, there's a story about every single one of those bars. In power and in buildings, I mean, there is still oil used today in some countries in the world for generating power. And that is switching to gas and renewables. And that's a very sensible thing. Also in buildings, we're seeing gradually the improvement in efficiency and the switch out of oil for heating through to gas and electricity in that sector. So not surprisingly, the use of oil in power and buildings is going down. Passenger vehicles, I'm sure you understand very well what's going on with that bar. we are seeing a significant improvement in the efficiency of passenger vehicles, but worldwide also a significant growth in numbers. So you end up with a flat picture for passenger vehicles. But then the real story here on this graph is the next three blocks: road freight, aviation and shipping, and petrochemicals. Sometimes people forget about the petrochemicals. Huge growth predicted in each of those sectors, giving rise overall to an overall demand growth of something like 10 million barrels a day, possibly more, between now and 2040. And it's worth taking note that these scenarios do reflect the policy decisions in strong policy areas like Europe and in parts of the US, and the policy development in China as well. And so what is the takeaway from that? Liquid fuels are going to be needed for decades. Internal combustion engines are going to be needed for decades. And the work of this community actually is really key to getting the efficiency there and getting the environmental performance in terms of air quality there. So actually, I think it's really appropriate that we share these messages and this context with you. But of course, there's also very clear targets for reducing CO2 emissions to meet the Paris goal. It's worth looking at, again, the work of others in this area to look at how do we replace petroleum in the very long term. This is work done for the German government. It was arranged by the German Energy Agency, DENA, and done by a consultancy called Prognos. And here they have looked, and I'll explain in very simple terms, they've looked at all of the uses of petroleum and the long-term potential for other technologies. And in the grey, they are showing technologies where other technologies can replace completely the use of liquids. But in the blue, their conclusion is hydrocarbons, renewable hydrocarbons, will be necessary in the long term. And as we've already seen, actually, sectors, chemical feedstock, aviation, marine, heavy-duty transport, these are the areas that are likely to need liquids for the long term. Perhaps the most graphic example of all, aviation, a Boeing 787 today, a very efficient wide-body long-distance jet, around 230 tons at takeoff, of which 100 tons is jet fuel. Of course, through most of the journey, there's a lot less than 100 tons, and towards the end of the journey, probably more like 30 or 20 tons. How much to replace that energy with electric batteries today? Around 2,000 tons. There is no chance that we can have long-distance aviation with battery-powered propulsion, certainly not in the foreseeable future. And so at this point, you have to come to the conclusion liquid fuels will be necessary. In fact, we would make the assertion that liquid fuels are simply the best. Liquid fuels are the best, most practical form of storing and delivering energy. You can make and transport liquid fuels from one side of the planet to the other very cheaply. You can store them for decades, and they work perfectly at a moment's notice with great control exactly where you need them to work. Actually, if you think about it, that is the nature's currency for energy storage. We are all internal combustion engines. We take in carbohydrates, essentially the same as hydrocarbons, and we emit just carbon dioxide and water, and creating some energy along the way. We are internal combustion engines. And so actually, nature already has many processes for making energy into molecules. We'll need molecules as part of the energy system. Also, just worth reflecting, what's going on in the power sector? I don't have a slide on this, but what's going on in the power sector today? We are heading towards higher and higher levels of renewables. But the amount of energy storage that is possible with batteries for the grid is tiny compared with what we have today. We as an industry store, on behalf of governments, 90 days of oil supply in Europe. That works out at around 1,500 terawatt hours of energy. We also do the same with gas in the gas industry in Europe, about 1,200 terawatt hours. Towards the beginning, in the first quarter of this year, Europe ran low on gas because of the prolonged cold spell in Northern Europe. And at that time, the European Commission held an important conference in the Berlaymont building here in Brussels, looking at energy storage options. And it was the CEO of a Danish power company who stood up and he said, we must be realistic about what grid storage we can do with electric vehicles. And he did the calculation for everybody. And remember, I've just given you the numbers. 1,500 terawatt hours of oil storage and 1,200 terawatt hours of gas. And he ran the calculation like this. Let's imagine we have 200 million cars. All of them are Teslas with a 100 kilowatt hour battery. They are all fully charged, plugged in, able to provide power back to the grid instantly. How much storage do you get? 20 terawatt hours. It's a tiny fraction of what we have with molecules today. So actually, these technologies for liquids are really important for transport and also the energy system overall. Right, back to the work that we've been doing in the industry. To be really clear, our industry has supported strongly the Paris Agreement. We came out before and after with clear press statements supporting the Paris Agreement, recognizing climate change as a global challenge requiring global action. We also have to keep the energy needs of the world supplied. We believe the fuels industry can be part of that long-term solution. And there are two key approaches to doing this. The first is to start introducing new feedstocks into the fuels production process, reducing the product-related greenhouse gas emissions through basically moving to a circular economy for carbon as opposed to the linear economy that we have today. And of course, that works hand in hand with more efficient vehicles. To take a very, very simple example, if you can halve the consumption of the vehicle and you can halve the carbon intensity of the fuel, you've got an end result which is 75% lower than you started out. At which point, if you could do that with cars, you'd have a similar carbon intensity to that of an electric vehicle today in well-to-wheel or in life cycle terms. We are also saying, as part of that strategy, we must reduce dramatically the GHG emissions from the refineries, the manufacturing process as well. These slides are all available publicly, by the way. You're welcome to take them. Now, I would imagine, certainly I speak for myself, when I was growing up, I could remember the discussion about what is it that replaces petroleum. There was the 1976 petroleum crisis. OPEC cranked up the oil price and everybody started looking at what's the alternative. And I remember the headlines, the car that runs on water. Some of you may remember that, yes? Of course, it was the hydrogen car. And then we've also since then had other suggestions that it can be natural gas or it could be hydrogen. And in each case, we usually come to the same conclusion. There is no silver bullet for replacing petroleum. We've come to the same conclusion. However, there are multiple technologies, including some of those I've just mentioned. Multiple technologies can be deployed together to give significant reduction in the carbon intensity of liquid fuels. And that's the basic concept. Starting from the left of this diagram to the right, we go through a series of technologies. We start with the manufacturing process itself. It's worth noting that of the overall footprint of a car or truck or aeroplane using fuel, 8% of that is actually in the manufacturing of the fuel. Refinery efficiency, we can plug in the refinery. We can, instead of using fuels in the refinery, we can use renewable electricity. Carbon capture and utilization and carbon capture and storage to take remaining emissions down to zero. Potentially even below zero if you can use biomass with CCS. We make hydrogen in refineries, a lot of it. It's part of the manufacturing process. Today, it's made from natural gas and with a CO2 footprint associated with that. We can replace that, and we've already got one unit in existence where that is being replaced by hydrogen made from renewable power. Fuel quality, for example, octane quality. We have an active discussion over raising the octane quality of European gasoline to a RON over 100, perhaps 102, that would enable an increase in the compression ratio and the efficiency of gasoline engines. Sustainable biofuels. It's been a long conversation. There is, I believe, consensus now. In fact, the European regulatory processes, has just landed on the regulation for 2021 to 2030, and there will be some role for sustainable biofuels that meet a European standard for sustainability and GHG intensity. That regulation also requires advanced biofuels made from non-food-based crops, typically agricultural or forestry waste, etc. And finally, and this is for the longer term, there are routes to make hydrocarbons synthetically using waste carbon and renewable hydrogen, or hydrogen from renewable power, which essentially is a route to make a kerosene, like a jet or a diesel fuel. It uses quite a lot of power, but it is a route to make a fuel that is chemically identical. And in fact, all of these technologies here are really capable of making a fuel that is extremely similar or identical to the fuel that we have today in terms of the fuel specifications, but through a circular economy route for the carbon. All of these technologies exist today. We are not talking about tiny experiments in laboratories. Every one of these technologies has got demonstration, industrial scale demonstration plants in existence with the technologies at this stage well understood. One of the things we need to understand better is what is the commercialization long term in terms of the costs. You might think that the refinery is then irrelevant if we move away from petroleum as a feedstock. Actually, we would say the opposite is true. If we think about what a refinery is, a refinery is a great big industrial factory that is already doing a great deal of swapping and managing carbon and hydrogen ratios in different products. It's typically located in a deep water port with great water access for large quantities of raw materials. It's typically got very large power connections already and is in close proximity to many other industries that have, for example, waste CO2 or other waste materials, including low-grade waste plastics. There is also, in some places, already a hydrogen network and a discussion of a CO2 network, and in particular in Rotterdam. So the potential integration of the refinery with other industries in a cluster can actually see the refinery start to emerge as an energy hub, connected with other industries through various infrastructure, including, as I've said, carbon and hydrogen. The beauty of this is that the revolution occurs in the feedstocks and in the manufacture. I should have mentioned residual heat actually can also be one of the exchanges that goes on in this industrial cluster. But the beauty is the infrastructure all exists, from the refinery right through to the end use for both petrochemicals production and also the end use of all modes of transport. The existence, or the infrastructure exists entirely from all the refineries right through to the skin of the vehicle, of the truck, of the aeroplane, of the ship. And so what we are essentially visualizing and proposing here is, just as we see the electricity grid being used in a transition from entirely fossil-based power generation to mostly renewables-based power generation, we're not seeing a new grid develop. We use the same grid. The grid that we have today for fuels, it goes all over Europe, and in fact, it goes all over the world, really, in effect. And that can be used to evolve the liquid fuel to have a lower and lower carbon intensity. So why do we think the industry can lead on this? Our industry actually has an extensive R&D capability and extensive experience already in hydrogen and biofuels technologies and growing experience in CCS. We're in industrial clusters and we have extensive project capability. The last point is one maybe that requires a little explanation. Carbon regulation in Europe is, and I respect the fact that this is not a word that the Commission likes. It is something of a patchwork of regulation, because we have a carbon market for industry with ETS, currently at a carbon price of about 15 euros. And then when we move to the world of transport, we have very different carbon policies with implied prices that are much, much higher. The penalty price in the CO2 in cars regulation, around 500 euros a ton. It's similar in the proposed truck regulation as well. In the blending of biofuels today, the penalty levels are different across countries, but they range between 300 euros a ton and 1,000 euros a ton. Much, much higher carbon costs for reducing carbon in transport versus in the industrial sector. Every one of the technologies that we've described here would be competitive in that transport carbon market, if you like. And we believe actually they would be cost effective versus electrification today. Of course, we may well see costs of electrification come down significantly. We can also see potential for these costs coming down as well. But to be clear, we believe the real focus of this strategy is around heavy-duty aviation and marine, where these sectors will have significant difficulty in going to full electrification, as per the answers in the room earlier, actually. Why do we believe this is attractive for the EU? The European Union has already described how they'd like to see the development of industrial clusters to get a circular economy in all types of resources and efficiency. And we believe that this is entirely consistent with this. We do believe low-carbon liquid fuels is complementary to electrification. One of the key advantages from a policy standpoint is that by changing the fuel, you reduce the carbon emissions or effectively the carbon impact of all the vehicles in circulation immediately. It does not require a turnover completely of the existing fleet. Of course, it complements Europe's lead on internal combustion engine technologies. And we've had already several discussions with car manufacturers and truck manufacturers about reflecting this strategy in their own powertrain strategies for mid-century. And we've said this uses existing infrastructure, which means that there is really no call on the public funding for infrastructure development. Long term, we know that the world will stop using petroleum, either because it's run out or because of very strong policy decisions. At that point, we know that we'll need molecular energy and in liquid and gaseous form. And we believe these technologies are key for the long term globally. And it's an opportunity for the EU and the companies in the EU to get very good at these technologies. And of course, skilled jobs in energy security. We've talked about energy storage and molecular forms of energy. We believe it's an important contribution and part of technology leadership for the EU. We are making some requests to the policy world, to the Brussels community, but also member states as well. We're asking in the first place that these technologies and a low carbon transition for fuels are included in Europe's industrial and technology strategies. And actually, we're very pleased to see already in Horizon Europe, there's already proposals in the leaked drafts of sustainable fuels being part of the focus. And we think that's very sensible. To make this work, we need long-term investor confidence. We believe the recognition in multiple different ways of these fuels and how they contribute. And just a key point that we think is important for every industry making this type of transition, we have to be competitive through a transition. Otherwise, we can't deliver in the long run. Now, that almost brings me to the end here. We believe this is really about reinforcing climate leadership for Europe through technologies and industrial strategy. I have just a couple of other pieces of work from Konkawi here, just to whet your appetite, maybe to look further as to what we're doing here. A very brief picture looking at the overview of the overall footprint of the use of what is today fossil fuels in liquid fuels. Around 12% of the overall impact in crude oil production, 8% in refining, and about 80% in the use of the vehicle and the combustion of the fuel. And just to underline, more efficient vehicles together with lower carbon intensity fuels result in a multiplied effect, giving you lower carbon transport. We are doing a number of pieces of work around this area. This is just a snapshot of some of the work we're doing to quantify what may be possible by 2030 and then by later dates. And clearly there's a lot of work behind that slide there. And I'm going to just show you here. These are reports that are available on the Konkawi website. The working plan is the overall structure of the work we've planned for the next 2 years or so to thoroughly evaluate and describe all of these technology components. The one on the right is the description of the manufacturing process. We've already done significant work on the manufacturing process. So there we are. That's our vision. Thank you very much for your attention.